Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to this technical walkthrough for IDEX. We're pleased to have Dileep and Jason from IDEX with us, who will be demonstrating the main functionalities of their code base and providing valuable insights about their protocol. From Immunefi side, I'm Daniel, and with me, Artem, our technical expert. IDEX Boost is already live with a 45K reward pool waiting for you. You can check it out on our website at immunify/explore/boost. So without further ado, Dileep, Jason, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, Artem. Thanks, Immunefi, for hosting us. And of course, thank you, White Hats, for joining and taking a look at the IDEX Boost. As a quick background, I'm Jason, CTO here at IDEX. Also on the call is Dileep, who is the principal engineer leading development of our smart contract suite for this release. So as a way of background here, IDEX is a bit of a long-running project. We've been live in the market since 2017 and been working with Immunefi since 2021. We're excited to launch our V4 product, which entirely replaces all previous versions. IDEX V4, the internal code name for which is Icon, which you'll see constantly sprinkled throughout our documentation here, is a hybrid perpetuals DEX. So as a hybrid architecture, the APIs, order placement, and matching engine live off-chain, while fund custody and trade settlements live on-chain. Both the on-chain and off-chain components are in scope for this bounty. Specifically, Icon is deployed to an app chain called XChain, and there's also a complementary XChain testnet. XChain is based on Arbitrum Orbit and settles to ETH L1 or Sepolium testnet form and uses AnyTrust for data availability. We targeted this particular configuration for high throughput with stable low costs on a proven technology stack. Details on that front regarding XChain can be found in the API docs, but I should note that XChain itself is not in scope here. And importantly, you can actually try out the testnet product today if you go to idex.io. There's a sandbox version of the exchange running on testnet and instructions to get a wallet funded and go try it out yourself. All right, so the program itself is broken into two main parts, the Boost program, that is. So there is coverage of the on-chain contracts, and then there's coverage of the off-chain application. Most of this presentation is going to focus on the on-chain contracts because they are open source. The repo is available as linked in the Boost, whereas the off-chain components are proprietary and will mostly be a black box exercise. Of course, we have extensive API docs on that front, and we can talk a bit about some of the focus areas there. But let's start by jumping into our primary repo for all the contracts for Icon here. So this repo here is the starting point and best source for both code and documentation for this particular release. The key contracts are deployed and verified on Block Explorer. Again, these are linked in the Boost page. And there are also extensive README and governance documents in the repo here that are the best source of documentation for how the system should work, some of the parameters and how they're tuned, controls on what can do what, and so forth and so on. So for most of this exercise, I think we'll take a look at what is in the README and how that translates into the code, and I'll be pointing out some different structural elements. And of course, if you have any questions, please let us know. All right, starting with contract structure. So there are three primary contracts that comprise the product here. So there's a custodian contract, there's a governance contract, and an exchange contract. The custodian contract has the primary responsibility of custodying funds. So when users deposit funds, they ultimately land in this contract. It's actually quite a simple contract by design, contains very, very little functionality, and by design is the place that holds funds, but all the logic is upgradable around it. So the idea here is that if we do need to perform an upgrade, we can perform a logic upgrade without any users having to migrate funds or touch their funds indeed at all, and all of it seamlessly translates through to future versions. One feature I'd like to point out here is an asset migration feature. So this is an interesting accommodation because the product runs on a particular collateral token. So that is the Stargate bridged in USDC Hydra token. So it's a very, very specific token that it uses for collateral. It's accessed via bridging on Stargate in layer 0. However, in the future, if there may be other collateral tokens that we want to switch to, this allows us to do a seamless migration, switch to other bridges or other sources of collateral that we want to swap one for one there. This is indeed in scope and is controlled by governance here. On the governance front, governance controls essentially all of the critical upgrade mechanisms in the system. So it covers both upgrades to the contracts themselves. So the governance allows an upgrade of both the exchange and the governance contracts, but it also allows contracts, some key configuration elements to be upgraded here as well. So for example, we have our bridge adapters that control how we interact with bridges. If we want to upgrade that functionality, that goes through governance as well. Really importantly, the primary model of the governance design is a two-step commit. So there is an initiate here, as you can see, and a finalize step for any of the individual upgrade areas. And the primary security model comes around delays. So these things can be replaced arbitrarily. However, there's an enforced delay between the initialization of an upgrade of any one of these features, and then the finalization where it's actually applied and added to the production logic. And that delay is the core mechanism by which the community can review any sort of upgrades, and of course, if they're not comfortable, withdraw funds or otherwise bring their concerns to the team or the community. I should note before diving into the exchange contract that there are a number of areas of pluggable support, the bridge adapters being one. So as you can see here, asset migrators, bridge adapters, index price adapters, and Oracle price adapters are all peripheral contracts to the core logic that integrate the service into a number of different areas. So we already touched on asset migrators. Again, there's a pluggable contract that can be added and then migrate if and when the community and project determines that we need a new collateral asset. From the bridges, we support currently, as I mentioned, Layer 0 V2 and Stargate V2, USDC Hydra OFT as the primary integration point for collateral deposits. Those are, again, pluggable upgrades. As that protocol continues to evolve, we can continue to evolve with it and take advantage of new features. And then similarly around index prices and Oracle prices, we currently support on the index price front, both Pith and our own internal self-signed index price service. As you can see, there are other potential providers that we can integrate as well. But to move on to the vast majority of the logic, exchange. So exchange implements the entry point to most of the logic of the exchange. It's a complex contract. It's quite long, has a lot of logic in it, and as a result, most of the functionality is actually implemented as delegate call libraries. So the code is isolated in these libraries, however, they're called as delegate calls and thus use the exchange contracts state storage in order to consolidate all the storage of the design in one place, while allowing us to extend the code base as far as we need to. So let's dive on in here. We can take a look and starting with the trading lifecycle. So as I mentioned before, USDC is the exclusive collateral token here. It's bridged in exclusively via layer 0 V2 and Stargate V2. And the entry point here, of course, is the deposit function. And this is a great representation of the structure that you'll see throughout the rest of this contract. So a few things to point out here, notably that the primary functionality, there's the function call, whatever parameters are here, and the primary functionality is wrapped up in a delegate call to one of the supporting library contracts, in this case, depositing. So another point to note here as part of the design is that you'll see this really, really frequently, that parameters for calls, both for the entry points and throughout the libraries, are really commonly made in relatively large structs. And this is due to stack limits and allowing us to pass around enough data to complete the functionality here. All right, and as you can see, that struct is defined here. There's also a separate structs file here that defines a number of items that are used throughout the system. All right, so in depositing, this is also quite common as a pattern you'll see here. We have a number of requires at the top here, a bit of functionality, and then to point out an interesting quirk here, we actually have a pending deposit system. So it's, again, a two-phase deposit. I don't want to cover it in too much detail. It is explained here, and it's relatively straightforward in what you see in the contract itself. You'll note that there's a separate apply step that happens here that ultimately impacts the balance tracking of the exchange. To explain a bit about why we have that is also a core concept of how most of the exchange works, and also is relevant to trading, withdrawing, and other functionality. The vast majority of the functionality of this exchange happens through what we call a dispatcher wallet. So because we have on-chain and off-chain systems, we need to synchronize the systems and the system state. And in particular, if you think about what's happening on the deposit front, a deposit is being made. It is being picked up by reading the chain and events on the chain. On the off-chain side, credits the wallet, but then also to ensure that that credit happens in the same sequence as all the other trading flow, withdrawal steps, and everything else, that credit is then applied back to the contracts in a way that allows us to maintain synchronicity between the on-chain and off-chain state. Similarly, the vast majority of other functionality that you'll see in Exchange is actually permissioned. So, for example, if we take a look at the execute trade function call here, you end up with only dispatcher as a modifier here, which again allows us to control when trades are settled based on order matching and synchronize the on-chain and off-chain systems. Okay, so trading is the primary functionality of the system as an exchange. This is, again, the entry point. As you'll see, structurally, it's quite similar to the deposit function. Effectively, it's a thin wrapper that then calls into the trading library, which implements the vast majority of functionality with the other supporting libraries. It's a delegate call, so again, modifies balance states that is tracked in the exchange itself. The arguments themselves are quite a few layered different structs. So if you take a look at the execute trade arguments, you end up having both the trade settlement as well as various orders that are captured within that and then wrapped through different order structs and trade settlement structs and all the parameters that represent that trade. So if we take a look at what's happening in trading, again, similar pattern for a lot of the system here. So we have structs defining arguments that are quite complex. We have a few events that are associated with trading. And then we have the primary execute trade delegate call, which is the entry point to this functionality. At the start of any of these functions that change the balance state of a wallet, we apply funding payments. If you're not familiar with perpetuals, It's a common mechanism across perpetuals. We can talk about it in a few minutes here, but just to note that you'll see this commonly at the start of any of these entry point functions that modify wallet balances. And then again, through here, enters various different points of functionality that says, for example, execute trade after funding. If we work through here, we see there's two main steps here. We're validating all the inputs, and then we're updating the balances. So tracing all this through, and again, a lot of this is separated into separate functions to manage stack sizes. We find that we again go to a sub-library here that talks about trade validations, and I want to take a quick look at what's going in there. The key security assumption of the exchange is that money cannot move without authorization from the original depositing wallet. So what that means is that when orders are placed, wallets sign the parameters of those orders. Those orders are then matched by the off-chain engine, and then those orders, when they are settled, when essentially they match against each other, are verified by this library itself. So as a result, we can prove that all the elements of the settlement match the terms of the order. And you can see how this ultimately plays out in the way that this library is structured. So first, we're verifying the asset pairs, then we're verifying the execution conditions, then we're verifying nonces, signatures on the orders, and fees. Each one of these things is reasonably self-explanatory, but I do want to touch on the nuance of settlement. So nonces. Nonces are a really important concept in the system in that they provide both replay protection against various orders being submitted more than once. They also, because we're using UUID V1s, they actually encode a timestamp. And as a result, we can make some assumptions about how it is that whether things are placed in time periods where they're valid, where they're invalid, and we can even invalidate nonces so that we can invalidate certain orders from the system that are prior to a certain date. This is essentially covered in this library, good times, but this extracts the timestamp from the nonce and allows us to then do some reasoning about it, as you can see, which we'll cover in a second here. For example, not validating nonce for orders. And you can see that we can get the timestamp and then test some assumptions about the validity of that timestamp relative to authorizations in something called a delegated key, which is again something I'll touch on in a little bit here. All right, I do want to touch on how it is that the signature scheme works here. So if we go to our signature scheme here, we're validating signatures. Essentially, as you can see, what we're doing is calling into hashing and validating signatures. And what we're doing on that front is first, we encode all the parameters of an order in a hash, and then we're actually validating this signature as a UUID, or excuse me, an EIP 712 signature, and confirming that indeed the signature provided by the order matches up with what's happening in the parameters of the order. And as a result, you can see we end up with a system that validates as many parameters as possible, validates that the original wallet had signed those parameters and intended that trade to happen, and indeed matches as expected. All right. On the withdrawal front, again, really similar pattern on withdrawals. So again, only dispatcher. This keeps everything synchronized. If you place a trade, then you do a withdrawal. This guarantees that, in fact, the trade settles before the withdrawal does. Withdrawal, again, has a similar structure. We look at withdrawing. That's a simple delegate call. It goes in there. Withdrawing then takes into account all the things that it needs to and withdraws funds from the custody contract all the way out back to the wallet through the bridge contracts. All right. One really important design consideration here. So there is something called a wallet exit. We'll get to it a little bit later in this presentation. That is a mechanism, a safety mechanism that allows users to withdraw funds even if the off-chain components of the exchange are not functional or censoring a user. They can still withdraw funds from these contracts by directly calling the withdraw exit function, and their funds will be returned to them with some important details to that. Like I said, we'll get to that in a minute, but I did want to point it out here. All right. I should note that there is, as noted here, a transfer function built into the contracts. This works similar to withdrawals, except instead of sending funds out of the custody contract, it transfers ownership to another wallet within the contract. Those are not yet supported by the off-chain components. All right. To touch upon two important concepts within the perpetuals exchange world, I'd like to talk about liquidation and ADL. So as is noted here, in some situations, wallets will fall below what is called their maintenance margin requirement, at which point the wallet will be liquidated to protect the solvency of the system. These functions here, there are a few different situations in which it happens. Again, the README kind of captures those situations. Each one of those has an entry point call within Exchange. But I'd like to take a look at the most common one just to show you how that pattern works and some of the common features of that pattern. Okay, so liquidating wallet in maintenance here. So again, exactly the same pattern you see elsewhere in the dispatcher. We call into a delegate call. And we're applying our funding payments, doing our validations. There are a few different pathways through which this can happen. Again, this kind of gets into some details that I'm happy to answer in questions, but a little bit beyond the scope of what we're talking about at this level. And then does its validation, updates its positions. Now, part of that validation, we do the validations that are possible to do at this point. And in particular, a wallet in maintenance liquidation does confirm that the wallet is in maintenance. This gets into a bit of discussion around margin. We'll talk about that in a minute. But again, I just want to emphasize the pattern that the goal of the contracts is to verify the state of the system to the degree it can and ensure the safety of the actions that are being submitted by the dispatcher. So in this particular case, the off-chain system cannot liquidate a wallet that is not in maintenance, and that is provable through the various states on the contract itself. Again, similarly, there are a handful of different ways that positions can be liquidated, positions or wallets can be liquidated. And again, these are covered here in more detail, but they all follow the same structure. Similarly, deleveraging is a process that happens in two different approaches. One, there's a concept of an insurance fund. The insurance fund cannot acquire a position because it lacks the resources to do so. Or two, if it cannot close a position for whatever reason due to the state of insufficient liquidity or any other condition. So again, this is a protection mechanism for the protocol that ensures that if a position or wallet needs to be closed, it can be under certain specific conditions. So again, similar structure to the way that liquidations work. I'll skip diving into the code on this because again, structure is really repetitive. It's quite densely, the code is quite dense, but one of the nice things about this is that through all these paths, you'll see very, very similar patterns in terms of how things are packaged, how things are first validated, balances are then updated, and funds moved as a result of that. All right, as I mentioned before, margin requirements. So IDEX defines a number of margin parameters per market. So these cover everything from the initial margin fraction, maintenance margin fractions. It has an incremental margin system. These get into a bit of details around that are very, very specific to perpetuals. But the point I'd like to make here is that all of this is provable within the contracts. So all the parameters on every market are, so if you look at a market, when we define a market, it has some of the baseline parameters, but it also has overridable market fields. And as you can see, all of these overridable market fields are defined here. So we encode all the way down to the contract configuration, all of the market parameters, and then this is what allows us to compute, for example, whether a wallet is in maintenance or not. We track the balances of the wallet across the system, and then can use these various parameters to compute whether a wallet is in fact in maintenance, not in maintenance, healthy, bankrupt, or whatever the state may be. I should note that, again, these parameters are changeable. This is a kind of important point going back to governance. However, due to the impact of changing these parameters, they're only upgradable with a delay. Again, it has that two-step initialize, finalize structure for upgrading these. Also, importantly, it is actually possible to apply a set of upgraded leverage parameters on a particular wallet and market combination. So if a particular wallet needs different leverage parameters, that is something that's possible as well. Index pricing is another really important core concept to Perpetual's exchange design. So index pricing provides a reference price for every market on the exchange. And indeed, that allows us to calculate a fair market value for a position. So while the exchange maintains its own order books, those order books can diverge from other order books, as is always the case with an exchange. But the index price provides a fair value for any position. Because it is provable as an index price is used throughout the system as the basis for critical steps such as whether a wallet has sufficient leverage to open a position, whether a wallet is in good standing, or whether it is maintenance and then can be liquidated, and so forth and so on. So index pricing, importantly, through our system, has a, as I mentioned before, has a pluggable interface. So right now, we support both PITH as a pricing source, as well as our own internally operated hardware-signed index price service. So we have these for redundancy. They both are provable on chain. Markets will have a canonical value as their current index price, and that index price is actually sent to the contracts by the dispatcher prior to any other actions. So for example, if index prices are being updated off chain, yet no trade settlements are happening on the market, only the most recent index price will be updated by the dispatch wallet prior to any sort of subsequent settlement that happens on chain. And as a result, again, the contracts can self-evaluate whether wallets are in good standing or not, or whether the particular actions are valid or not. I should note Oracle pricing, just to touch on this briefly, if the exchange is offline for whatever reason for a period of time, Oracle pricing provides price updates in a similar manner to index pricing for any actions that are available in that case, in particular, exiting funds directly from the contracts. Funding payments, again, are another classic part of a perpetuals exchange design. As I mentioned, index price and order book price can diverge within a perpetuals exchange. And the funding payment mechanism is what brings those back in line. Essentially, every period, in our case, every 8 hours, there is calculation done about the relative skew between the order book and index price, and then longs pay shorts or shorts pay longs to essentially bring those pricing or incentivize bringing those pricing back in line. Funding payments are an interesting challenge for this particular architecture because if you think about it, if you have 1,000 wallets that have open interest in a market and you need 1,000 longs to pay shorts or 1,000 shorts to pay longs, that is an awful lot of transactions to have to dispatch on a tick, multiplying that by however many markets you have. Every 8 hours, you can create a significant amount of traffic that may take a significant amount of time to settle on a tick that ideally happens more or less instantaneously at that 8-hour interval. So we have an interesting mechanism implemented through the funding contract and the funding multiplier quartet helper contracts that actually applies these lazily. So the really important concept here is that the funding rate is computed on the 8-hour basis, and only a single update is made to the contracts, which essentially posts the funding rate that is the valid rate for that 8 hours there. Only later, when a wallet is then an actor in any sort of other balance update action, so whether that's settling a trade, withdrawing funds, whatever it may be, all of those outstanding funding payments are then lazily applied to the wallet balances, and therefore the wallet is then up to date. And this is the way that we avoid having to generate a large number of transactions on the funding payment tick. And I should also mention, as the funding multiplier quartet helper, that these funding rates are tightly packed in order to optimize the gas costs of S loads during that lazy application. But again, pretty well contained in funding and funding multiplier quartet helpers. Wallet exits. As I mentioned before, wallet exits are a really important safety mechanism within the system. Because it's a hybrid design, it's possible that the off-chain components are unavailable. It's possible that a malicious actor is censoring wallets from withdrawing or taking other actions within the system. And as a result, we have this mechanism which allows users to go directly to the contracts and withdraw their collateral. It's a two-step process. So wallets first call an exit on their wallet. And if things are operating normally, this will proactively liquidate all of their positions and then make that collateral available for withdrawal in a separate call. Also, if there is a parameter that you can find, again, in this governance contract, it covers all the important parameters of the system here. There is a chain propagation delay. So this is usually configured for about 1 hour, the chain propagation period, which is the delay to allow the synchronization between off-chain and on-chain systems. And if that expires, then wallets are then allowed to fully withdraw funds from the system directly from the contracts. The logic of how the collateral balance is calculated is the same, regardless of the pathway, whether it's proactively liquidated off-chain or whether it is that period expires and the user subsequently withdraw those funds from the contract directly. There's one really important detail here to cover, though. The exit value of positions is not the same based on if it's withdrawn through the normal withdrawal course than through the exit withdrawal course. So to protect the solvency of the system, during exit withdrawals, a position's value is the worth of the entry price or the index price. Put another way, that means that unrealized profits are not credited, whereas unrealized losses are credited. So this is an important point and allows the system to guarantee solvency. So again, if you think about the variance of index prices while, for example, the exchange is offline, let's say for whatever reason, all the off-chain components just disappear forever. Those index prices still keep fluctuating. And if those index prices fluctuate in such a way where wallets cannot be proactively liquidated through the normal mechanisms like maintenance and so forth, then we end up in a situation where you cannot guarantee that the system has sufficient resources to credit everyone at every point in time going forward. However, by only crediting the worst of the index price or entry price, it is guaranteed that everyone will indeed receive as much as possible while meeting that guarantee. I should note that there is another wallet that is the counterparty that absorbs all those positions. It is called the Exit Fund wallet. And I won't go into too many details, but part of the intent here is any sort of surplus that is rendered from that process ultimately lands in the Exit Fund wallet. That is withdrawable with a delay. But the idea here is that ultimately the protocol, for whatever extended outage happens, would then be able to, with a delay, withdraw those funds from the exchange and then assess which parties may need to be made whole with those overhanging funds. Finally, I would like to talk about delegated keys briefly. So delegated keys are a mechanism that allows our web client and mobile client, web app, to interact with the exchange in a really seamless way. So as I mentioned, in order to place an order on the exchange, the depositing wallet needs to sign the parameters of that order. Obviously, that's a bit of a clunky process through something like MetaMask or hardware wallet. In order to make that really seamless and have a very similar experience to a centralized exchange, delegated keys are authorized by the depositing wallet, and then are allowed themselves to sign all the order parameters to place an order. So, as you can imagine, within a client itself generates a delegated key. The user then signs that delegated key with their hardware wallet or MetaMask or whatever they may be using. And then that key never leaves that client and signs any orders that the user wants to place through the web client. So it's a really nice mechanism that allows, again, really seamless interaction, one-click order placement, one-click order cancellation, etc. And of course, has the chain of authorization that's implemented throughout the contracts. All right, so there's a lot here. Like I said, there's a lot of detail covered within the README, a lot of detail covered within the contracts. Just want to stop here, shift gears a little bit to talk about the app program. So on the other side of the on-chain systems, we have our off-chain systems. This is covered by both our API. We have our client that is available again for anyone to check out at IDEX.io. And both the API, the REST API, WebSocket API, and client are all in scope there. Although, like as I mentioned, they're not open source, so there's not too much to cover on the direct code side of things. I should note that there is a pretty standard security model. Different endpoints have different layers of security. There are both a pretty standard HMAC approach to authorizing requests, but then also all the details of how you generate these wallet signatures that contain all the parameters of an order, for example, or of a withdrawal are all documented here. Again, these are conforming to EIP 712, and as well as, of course, a short explanation of delegated keys and how these interact with each other. I've been talking for quite a while here. Dileep, do you have anything else that you'd like to add or specific areas to cover before we open it up to questions? Oops, sorry, it's on mute. Yeah, nothing specific to add at this point. I think that's a great overview, but yeah, quite a bit to dig in on the contract. So very happy to answer any questions or any areas that we didn't fully fill in there.
Thanks, Dileep. So, Artem, you would like to guide the
Sure.
Q&A session, please?
Yeah, sure. I think we can start with Immunefi questions, the one that we prepared. And after that, we can go and check out the questions that were sent to us by the audience. So guys, my first question is like, what are the most important bugs that you have received in your previous audits and that you were like quite surprised and didn't expect to see?
Yeah, we conducted 3 audits so far on outside of the Boost program here. We did not have any critical or high vulnerability bugs. There were, of course, with a code base as large as complex as this, some interesting ones around very low values of data. So there are some interesting pathways that if pricing falls super low, you end up with truncation issues in the values. I should note, of course, everything is integer math. So as you do divisions and of that nature, super low pricing or other kind of edge case scenarios could end up in situations like that. So those are some of the more interesting ones that were found in that process. Dileep, I don't know if you have any others that stick out to you. Yeah, I would say integer math has always been kind of a prevailing thing. Again, I don't think anything was super surprising just because also they were low severity, all of the findings there. So mostly around best practices and things like that. Nothing really in the core logic that was flawed so far in our audits.
Okay, thank you guys. So I think that I think that the threat modeling of your system didn't really change since you said that like you didn't really receive any bugs that were like very, very unexpected. Yes?
That's correct.
Okay. So let's go to the next question. What do you think that are the most important areas of your code base that you feel that like white hats and researchers should focus more on looking for bugs?
Yeah, I mean, I think a few areas are really critical. So balance tracking is actually surprisingly nuanced throughout the system. In addition to things like margin calculations, as I mentioned, the funding payment system has a lot of nuance in it. I'd say that given the complexity of the various systems, there are kind of details of each one that are interesting. However, I am not aware of a broader area that is more critical than others. Again, all this really does need to work in order for the exchange to work as a whole. Yeah, I would agree. They're all equally important, obviously. Another thing that I think is definitely worth investigating would be all the different order conditions being satisfied. Again, not to say that they're more important, but they are very extensive. There's quite a few different things that can be specified by the user, and we do need to honor all of those. So that is a pretty large area, I think, to investigate in the contracts.
Okay, thank you guys. I think I think that this recording in particular will be very useful for the researchers that prepare for the for looking the bugs in your code base. But maybe you can share some resources that will allow white hats to learn more about like your project and the code base.
Sure, as is linked in the Boost page. So we have docs.idex.io, which provides a nice user-facing overview of how the product is intended to work. The repo contains an extensive README and governance doc, as I mentioned. The code itself is quite well documented. I also should note that it has a fully covered test suite. So for anyone who wants to look at what the intended functionality is, it's 100% coverage across all the core metrics there. and that is also available in that repo and is just a few lines to build and run. And then, of course, finally, on the application side, we have our API docs that should be extensive and well covered. And then potentially another interesting resource, we have a comprehensive TypeScript, JavaScript SDK that implements kind of all the core logic here of things like, how do users sign orders and things of that nature. So if you want to take a look at how it is that, an application interacting with the exchange might sign an order, that's a great place to see working code and be able to take a look at exactly how those nuances play out.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so another question, can you maybe tell us a little bit more about different access control roles in the protocol? Because as you can understand, like this privilege escalation or like mismatching with the access control, usually, it makes a mess. So
yeah, indeed. All right, let me share again really quickly. Classic, great area to focus on here. So all the primary access controls are implemented in this owned contract. They're really standard. Essentially, there's an owner role and an admin role. To summarize, the owner role, the only job of the owner role is to be able to change the admin role, and then the admin role has the ability to take all sorts of actions, including initiate and finalize contract upgrades, change parameters such as the chain propagation period, or delegated key expiration time, or any of that stuff. So the contract itself, really, really simple. It is, of course, implemented by the key contracts like exchange and governance. But if you want a human readable explanation of exactly how this plays out, so you can see here, this document contains a point-by-point explanation of all those controls, what they can do, and what the generally intended parameters that are configurable here are.
awesome. Thank you for this clarification. So we have 2 more questions left. What do you think? What areas do you think will be the most challenging for auditing? Yeah, for researching, like maybe some complicated parts, some unusual parts that will, that can cause problems or like take more time for the whiteheads to look at.
I would flag that there are a lot of nuanced core logic mechanisms for sure. But one of the areas that makes it pretty interesting is the integration points with some of these other services. So I should note that while, for example, a bug in layer 0, which of course Immunefi also has a bounty for, is not in scope for our bounty, a bug in the integration of how ours works with that protocol is certainly in scope. So it is one of those areas that, again, it's a little bit, you'd have to understand those protocols, or at least dig into those protocols reasonably well to kind of reason through how those integrations work. So I do think that's kind of one of those interesting areas that goes beyond kind of the nuances embedded in our system with how it integrates with others. And that's true also of, for example, index pricing with PIP.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. And the last one. So, maybe about the principle, like about the KISS principle, about keeping it simple and stupid. So if the code is simple, and it contains less bugs, but it's just sometimes this principle is just not applicable to the real world. So I'm interested in maybe you have some really complex code base, parts of code base that involves a lot of logic, a lot of different parts, like because these kind of code bases usually have higher potential for more bugs. Maybe you can share with the whiteheads here what part of your code bases are the most complicated ones.
Sure. So again, we have endeavored to keep things as simple as possible, but to your point, there's a limit to how much that is realistically possible given what we're trying to achieve here. Yeah, as I mentioned, the funding payment mechanism is a pretty interesting one. We can definitely stare at that code for a bit of time because there are a bunch, as I said, funding payments are quite tightly packed, and then there's a bunch of offsets that need to happen and things of that nature. I think that's a pretty interesting one. I think all of the kind of leverage calculations, so there's a number of calculations that compute things like bankruptcy, pricing, and things of that nature that get into a lot of nuance as well. Yeah, those are two that come to mind. Dileep, do you have any others you'd like to flag?
Yeah, I think I already touched on all the different order execution parameters, as well as liquidation and deleveraging. Can be a little bit complicated to understand just because the accounts involved need to be in a certain state along with index prices for those actually to get triggered. I would add all of these areas that do seem complicated. The unit tests that we have available are very helpful, I think, in understanding these just because they do exercise every combination that we've thought of along with preconditions and postconditions. So I think that's a really great way to kind of understand exactly how that logic works.
Cool. Thank you for your answers, guys. I bet they will be very useful for the researchers. And yeah, we have a lot of questions from Alice Costello. Sorry if I mispronounced your nickname. So yeah, we have them in the chat, but I'll just read them out loud for the recording purposes. So the first question is like, what's the API written in?
Our off-chain components are primarily implemented in TypeScript.
Okay, TypeScript. So can you deposit through an API in V4, or you can only do it on chain?
So it is only on chain. The SDK will have functions that kind of wraps those things to make it relatively easy to implement, especially considering that vast majority of the users are coming from, they're bridging collateral in from ETH-L1 or Arbitrum or wherever in order to get their funds into the contract. So yes, even though it is executed as an entry point in the contracts, there is SDK support to keep that simple.
Okay, so the next question is, can you talk a little bit more about the exit fund and the key purpose of it?
Yeah, sure thing. So if you're familiar with the way insurance funds work in perpetual exchanges, they absorb the positions of a wallet that gets liquidated. It's the primary role. So wallet falls below its maintenance margin requirement, the system liquidates the wallet. Some party needs to take over the positions that were opened by that wallet, and that's the insurance fund in ordinary operations. Let's assume that the off-chain components are just not available and the contracts are sitting on their own, and you have whatever wallets with whatever positions that are sitting in the contract state. The exit fund is the counterparty of last resort, so to speak. So if you exit your wallet, and then as part of that, in order to withdraw collateral, all of those positions need to go somewhere. So the exchange always has to have open interest. Longs always need to equal shorts in any market. So just because that wallet closes those positions doesn't mean those positions are have reduced the open interest in the system overall. So they need to go somewhere. That somewhere is the exit fund. So the exit fund will take any amount of positions in any market. And of course, if the exit fund receives a long position and then subsequently receives a short position, they net against each other, and that results in actual open interest closure. So that's how we can essentially deterministically support the exit of all wallets of the system, even in an off-chain state without proactive liquidation, again, without creating any solvency issues to the protocol. Now, as I mentioned, the key distinction with the pricing that you get for those positions when you exit through that mechanism is that it does not realize unrealized profit, but it does realize unrealized loss. So as a result, if you kind of think about it here, that would mean that all of the overhanging profit of the system essentially lands in the exit fund. If you just went through and exited every wallet in the system, essentially all the unrealized profit would sit in the exit fund at the end of that process. All the positions we closed, it would just be sitting there as USDC. Good news, everyone got whatever USDC they could out of the system, but now there's a pile of USDC and that's owned by the exit fund. The intent there is that something had gone seriously awry prior to any of this happening, which is why it's off-chain. Who knows why? And at which point there is the ability to withdraw those funds from the exit fund with a significant delay to allow any wallets that want to withdraw to be able to do so. And then those funds, of course, the intent being that because there is no known state ahead of time about why it is that those funds or why the exchange is offline or who those funds ought to be credited to, that's a decision to be made kind of after the fact about where those funds need to go.
Cool, thank you. And the next question will be, can you give us more information about invalidate nonce flow?
Yeah, sure thing. So as I mentioned, nonces provide a few roles in the system, one of which is timing and one of which is authorizing delegated keys. So as I mentioned, the timestamp is embedded in a UUID v1 nonce. But also something I didn't touch on is that orders that get canceled in the system they don't change contract state because the order books from the system are off-chain. If an order is placed in an order book, never generates a settlement, and then is canceled from the order book, it just disappears from the order book state, and the on-chain components know nothing about it. This is essentially the key mechanism that allows the exchange to have the performance that matches centralized exchanges, because oftentimes you'll see 3 or 4 orders of magnitude of the number of orders placed in the system versus the number of settlements made as a result of those. So that's how we can achieve this high throughput, low latency trading experience while also settling in a way that's deterministic, provable, and custody through contracts rather than through a wallet that we control. So the problem is that if you place all these orders and they get canceled, there are still valid orders that are signed somewhere, potentially in the ether, right? So they, we of course cancel them out of our state, but that order has been placed and could, in theory, if an attacker had access to our off-chain systems, be capturing those order flows. Those are signed valid orders, and they could, in theory, be submitted later. Another mechanism, like I said, is the nonce is also embedded in delegated key validation time. So delegated keys are only valid for a particular period of time. It's a configurable period of time. For the purpose of this conversation, let's say 30 days. And of course, there's a mechanism in the contracts that confirms that, in fact, the order nonce and the delegated key nonce validation window line up correctly. So we can say that for sure this was a valid delegated key when this order was placed. However, as you can see, if somebody got access to a stream of orders, they could just submit them later on and say, okay, well, here we go, and create all sorts of havoc. And that's all still provable on chain as valid. The nonce invalidation mechanism is a hard guarantee within the system. So for anyone who kind of cares to maintain practices around invalidating canceled orders on a periodic basis, or if they want to hard invalidate any of the delegated keys that are open, for example, if they believe there's a problem with their browser and their delegated key got compromised or whatever it might be, we have soft revocation mechanisms that work the same way in our off-chain system. Essentially invalidates that key, doesn't allow any orders through at that point. But again, they're still provable on chain. So the nonce invalidation mechanism says any nonce before this date is no longer valid in the system. And as a result, it becomes impossible to submit those previously submitted and then canceled orders or use any delegated keys that were authorized prior to that date. So it's again, similar to wallet exits, kind of a hard security guarantee that we provide for anyone who is concerned about those issues.
Thank you for your answer, and I think this will be our last question. Like, did your past audits cover the API as well as the smart contracts?
They did not. So previous audits focused entirely on the smart contracts. Now, of course, the smart contracts heavily interact with the off-chain systems, but the API itself was not in scope for those audits.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, let's wrap it up. Thank you everybody who came here today to listen. Thank you guys for giving giving the insights from your project's perspective about your code base. I bet this will be very, very helpful for our whiteheads to actually find to look for bugs in your system. Yeah, thank you again for your time, and happy hunting, guys.
Thank you, Dileep and Jason, for this in-depth walkthrough. And thank you, Artem, for guiding the security researcher through their question with clear explanation for the IDEX team. So I would appreciate everyone who's attended here this call. We have an open channel on Discord with all IDEX team members. If you have any questions, please join the channel. The recording of this call will be posted by tomorrow at the latest. So once again, thank you and happy hunting. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.